What's going on, Sirens fans? Welcome back to another episode of Siren Sounds. I think this should be a pretty fun one, right? I mean, listen, I've still got some energy kind of coursing through me from that MSG game. Recording this Monday afternoon, but how about Saturday night? The Sirens become the first PWHL team to host a game at Madison Square Garden. They set the United States professional women's hockey attendance record. 18,006 was the sellout MSG crowd. And then you want to talk about sending those fans home happy. A 2-1 shootout win, a thriller, another come-from-behind win, so that's the second one in a row. We joke sometimes in sports about scriptwriters, right? They couldn't, hard to write up a better ending than that, right? I think they did a pretty good job. Just a special event, man. It's special to be there, special to cover it. I think... From what I've seen on social media, it seems like a lot of the people that I follow were at that game. And even if you weren't, if you got to sit down and watch that game, I think it's a pretty cool, right? The long-term and big picture, pretty big moment for women's hockey overall. But for the Sirens, right? And for Sirens fans that have had to go through a lot of either uncomfortable conversations or sometimes just straight-up mean conversations, right? About attendance and being the least attended team in the PWHL, to have this moment on such a big stage and on such an iconic venue like Madison Square Garden, to set that record, that's Sirens fans. I think you've earned the right to soak this one up a little bit, right? Like this is a long time coming. It's a really cool moment for the team and the players as well. Special is the word that's come up a lot. That's the word that I think seemingly almost every player has used. Between Tuesday at practice, when they hit the ice at the Garden for the first time, Saturday, either before or after the game. Every Sirens interview that I've seen about the Garden, I think every single player has said the exact phrase of "it's so special," and they mean it. So that's you could tell that it meant a lot to them, and then it lived up to the hype. I think it almost exceeded it in my eyes, because it legitimately one of the wildest atmospheres that I've ever witnessed at the Garden. And I don't say that lightly. I spent 3 years covering the New York Rangers at Fordham, so got to see multiple playoff runs. I've been there for multiple playoff wins. I was on press row when Vincent Trocheck scored in double overtime against the Carolina Hurricanes in the second round of the playoffs. I was there when Keandre Miller scored with 0.6 seconds left against Dallas earlier that season. So I've been in that building for big games, for playoff games. I've heard that crowd erupt. I like to think that at least in recent vintage with the Rangers, I've been there for some of the biggest home games, certainly recently in team history. So I've seen some of the best Garden crowds in recent history. And, I remember after Saturday night, right, during Saturday night with this game, after the anthem and the starting lineups and right around puck drop, I remember turning to my left, and there's Johnny Lazarus, who I got to know on the Rangers beat for a little bit, and we both kind of looked at each other and went, oh, this has a playoff feel to it. And if you've ever been to the Garden, MSG just alone, even a regular season game, has a pretty intense feel to it, I would say. Certainly, games at the Garden feel different than regular season games at other venues, and that holds true for both the Rangers and the Knicks, especially when those teams are competitive. But when we talk about playoff games at the Garden, that is a different animal entirely. And there's all the angst and the excitement, and the energy and the nerves, all that stuff is palpable before the game, during warm-ups, during the announcements, and then it carries through. And I think you saw a lot of that on Saturday night with this Sirens Torrent game. That we'll talk a little bit more about the starting lineups and some of the ovations and the anthem and stuff like that. It was big. It was a big game feel. You could really feel the crowd be into it. And then it carried all the way through. And that's a really hard thing to get. A lot of different things have to go right for you to get a game, especially a regular season game, that carries that playoff atmosphere all the way through. Because I'll even say, right, like, if you remember on March 8th when the Sirens set a home attendance record with over 8,000 fans against Ottawa, that game had moments that had the elevated feel, borderline playoff feel. But I even remember coming on, I think this was my first episode of this, and I said, like, obviously it wasn't the whole game. It's a ton of stretches that you can point to on that March 8th game where it just felt like a regular season hockey game. Not a ton of moments in this game. And again, a lot needs to go right. Like, you need, a close game where that energy and that excitement and that nervous energy is going to hold all the way through. You need stakes. And obviously this game had playoff stakes for New York. And you need a crowd that's so nervous at the thought of losing that it could kill them. And that's really what it felt like. It's special is 100% the right word. I want to go back to the national anthem because that's what Sarah Fillier pinpointed. Another one of our Sirens beat reporters, Brianna Ebish, asked a really good question about, is there a specific moment you can think of where this crowd really sank in? And Sarah pointed to the anthem. And during the first stanza of the song, a Let's Go Sirens chant kind of broke through. And she's like, I've never heard a crowd that engaged before during an anthem. And she recalls standing on the blue line and, a little bit of a longer introduction than usual because ceremonial puck drop and they got to go through starting lineups. And, right, there's a little bit of a big event to this thing that they're a little more of a ceremonial feel to it. And she's like, the longest 5 minutes of my life just waiting for puck drop. She did all that energy building, witnessing all that energy. She said she got goosebumps, so excited, just waiting, like, let's drop the puck, let's play. I'm so excited. We should talk a little bit about some of the starting lineups and the introductions because, well, Billie Jean King gets a huge ovation when she comes out to drop the puck, and well-deserved. But then B, the starting lineups. You get a few different things that you're looking for. I was really curious to see what the reception was going to be for Corinne, Schroeder, and Alex Carpenter. Both of them spent 2 years with the Sirens, left unprotected this offseason, both get claimed by Seattle. And, we have enough of a history here, we've seen enough this season to know former Sirens usually get big hands. Abby Rock got a really good reception, Jade Downey Landry, Ella Shelton. The Sirens fans are pretty good about showing love. Like, they really do like those players, and they still have a lot of good feelings and good memories with those players. So, you had a feeling it was going to be positive, but, like, how intense is this going to be? This is MSG's 18,000 people in the building. And, Schroeder got a big hand. I thought Carpenter got an even bigger hand. And then even the captain, Hillary Knight, got a really big hand. And right, obviously, she's a legend in this sport, but I think the Olympics probably played into that as well, with her getting that game-tying goal against Canada. So they all get really big hands. On the Sirens side, like, it's your usual suspects. Kaylee Osborne gets a good cheer. Micah Zandy Hart. The two biggest ones are Fillier and Casey O'Brien. Certainly, I think Fillier's probably had a little extra fuel from that hat trick Wednesday. That fans were extra amped up to see her. And then with Casey O'Brien, she's a New York native. And the PA announcer, I'll shout out a Fordham Ram here, a Fordham alum, Mike Watts. Mike Watts was the PA announcer, and in his script, he tees it up, and it's and New York native, something along those lines, and that incited a nice cheer from the crowd for Casey O'Brien. So that's all really cool, and again, then that energy carries all the way through. Like, at one point, I'll shout out another Fordham, not alum, she's still going there, Lydia Perner. She's a junior at Fordham. We worked at FUV together, and at one point she's sitting on press row with me, and she goes, this is the loudest I've heard the Garden in 2 years. Granted, perhaps an indictment on the Rangers for their performance the last couple of seasons. But that's the type of environment it was, that you had, these are reporters that have seen a lot of really big hockey games in that building. And certainly took note of the energy. So I think that's pretty cool. One of the cool things that Johnny Lazarus actually asked about postgame, and it's become a thing on the Rangers beat, is this this concept of the Garden Roar. And what it is, basically, is certain Ranger games, when the angst builds up, in a big game like this, missed chances, whatever, close game, all that angst and all those nerves build up, and if something good happens, it releases and explodes in a very special type of reaction. And I think, looking at this game, we got 3 Garden Roars. The first is Sarah Fillier tying that game with about 3.5 minutes left to go in the third. I mean, you got to remember, right? Carpenter scores early in the second, and for a while there, there was a very real chance that the Sirens were going to get shut out at Madison Square Garden. Right, not just a big game, but a game with playoff implications. So when Sarah gets that game-tying goal, you certainly felt the relief from Sirens fans in that cheer when they exploded there.
Drukowski has a lane, she takes it, backdoor, they score! Sarah Fillier lights up MSG! We're all tied at 1!
And then I would say when Nyland Pearson scores in the shootout against Schroeder, that got a big cheer or one stop away from getting this win. And maybe the biggest crowd pop of all, and it makes sense, is Kaylee Osborne turning away Alex Carpenter in the 5th round of the shootout. I tweeted about it afterwards because I remembered it being loud, but I was on the train and I went back to my tweet and I opened up the video to listen to that crowd pop, and it was louder. It was even louder than I remembered. And that's you're not always guaranteed a final crowd punch like that. Like even and it was only 8,000 people on March 8th against Ottawa, but that was a really good atmosphere at the Rock. And the Sirens got a good cheer and a good applause after the final horn, but that was a 6-2 win. So not much of a climax there, right? So they get a cheer, but there's something very authentic about winning the game on one play, and that Osborne save won them the game. And so there was a very authentic and lively response from the crowd that, again, you were not guaranteed to get that. A, you were not guaranteed to get a Sirens win, but B, you were not guaranteed. That's like it's like a walk-off win in baseball. That's a special type of reaction that you weren't guaranteed to see. And I think it's pretty cool that it ends up working out that way. So that was really cool. The other cool crowd moment that I really wanted to harp on, because I think it was one of the sagas and one of the storylines that I was following, is kind of this saga between Alex Carpenter and the Sirens fans. Obviously, she gets the ovation at the beginning of the game, but then she scores in the second period. And if you watch that goal, man, is it a cold celebration, because she turns, right, she goes to the corner after she scores, she turns, she looks up, and she shushed the crowd. I mean, if that's not ice in your veins, you got to have some courage to do that in front of a sold-out Madison Square Garden crowd. And she did. And man, it's badass. That's just a badass moment. And then the Sirens fans kind of give it back to her in the shootout. She gets booed twice in that shootout, right? She shoots in the second round and the 5th. So she gets booed in the second round, goes down and snipes top shelf on Osborne. And again, I remember looking at my editor, Jim Cerny, and just going, oh my gosh, is she built for the moment or what? And then she gets booed again in the 5th round, and Osborne makes the stop that time around. That's it's authentic, and that's what's special about that is, there's been some discourse about, the PWHL needs rivalries and a little bit of hatred. And I don't disagree. I think that's a big part of sports is hating the other team and hating the other team's players. And what you have to understand, if you feel a little uncomfortable about that, is that, it comes from the name fanatics, right? Being a fan, it's irrational. There's not a lot of logic in there. Now, we try to be logical fans, and as a reporter, it's even more of an onus to be logical and objective. But at your core, being a fan is a little illogical. And you're going to hate teams and players for no other reason other than that they're playing against your favorite team. But there's something built into this of, all right, Alex Carpenter shushed the crowd, so now the crowd has a chance to get her back. I think that all came together very organically. And so, it wasn't forced, and that's that, you don't want it to be forced. Obviously, you'd like to see intense rivalries in the PWHL. And I think it's cool when fans hate players. I think that adds a certain edge. A lot of times there are players that feed off of that. I think Alex Carpenter is someone that feeds off of that thing, man, But it wasn't forced, right? It was organic. And so I thought that was a moment that I was like, that's perfect. That's what you want to see in this sport. That's what you want to see in this league. And then I think, this moment is probably elevated by the playoff stakes, right? Like this was going to be a big game no matter what. It's the PWHL's first foray into Madison Square Garden. Yeah, that is a huge deal. A lot of eyeballs on that game from people that have not necessarily been watching the PWHL every game or all season or been tuning in. A lot of new eyeballs on it. So that, it was going to be a big deal. But, right, the Sirens came into that game trailing a playoff spot by 5 points. And again, I think I said this before. If they lose that game, you're not eliminated from playoff contention. But Seattle's in last place in the standings. You need that win. That's a really important win to stack some points, gain some momentum, maybe galvanize you down the stretch. So there's real implications in that game. And I think that kind of gets wrapped up and tied up in the atmosphere that we saw. And I think you can tell that even though, right, there's more playoff stakes for New York than anything else. But Seattle wanted that game bad. And I think there's an element of Schroeder and Carpenter and their return to New York that they really wanted to win that game. And, post-game, Carpenter was one of the players that was there alongside Hillary Knight. And not tears streaming down her face, but you could tell that she had been crying. And you could tell that this was an emotional game for her and one that she really wanted to have. And, will we ever really know exactly? Will it ever be public, I should say, about what went down with the Sirens in this offseason and the players that they decided to part ways with? There's a lot of talk about improving the culture from last offseason. So, probably a lot of inside baseball stuff that will probably never be public. But for two players in Alex Carpenter and Corinne Schroeder that were beloved by the fans, and, to a certain extent, it was a tough position for the Sirens where you got to protect three players, and, they chose three players that they really wanted to build around in Sarah Fillier, Micah Zandy-Hart, and Ella Shelton. And, they end up trading Ella Shelton for essentially Casey O'Brien. But, that was a player that they were keen on keeping. But then the trade arose, that opportunity to make that trade arose, and they took that opportunity. Listen, Alex Carpenter and Corinne Schroeder are great players, though. And had the Sirens really wanted to keep them, could they have figured out a way? I mean, you're losing a great player or multiple great players no matter what, right? That's how expansion goes. But for two elite players like Alex Carpenter and Corinne Schroeder, I think it's fair that if you're a professional hockey player with a little bit of pride, that even if you don't, let's say, hate the Sirens and don't hate that organization, that there's a little bit of, in that game, especially at the Garden, no less, on that stage of, hey, let me show you what you're missing out on. Okay, you left us unprotected. I'm going to make you regret that you didn't do that. And I think that's even, you want to talk about like organic and healthy rivalries. You don't have to hate the Sirens if you're a professional hockey player, to feel that way. I think that's a very normal thing for players when an organization decides to move on from them. That even if there may not be no quote-unquote ill will, all right, but when I play you, I'm going to let you know what you're missing. And even though the Sirens win that game, they get a pretty good look at what they're missing, right? Because Carpenter for a while looked like she could have been the hero of that game with the goal early in the second period. Again, she has the moment where she shushes the crowd. She's also the only player that scored against Kaylee Osborne in the shootout. So things went pretty well for Alex Carpenter. I would say Corinne Schroeder had an even better game. 37 saves on 38 shots. One of the reasons that game even reaches the shootout is because of Corinne Schroeder. She made 2 breakaway saves, one on Maddie Wheeler in the second period, another on Ann Czerkowski in the waning moments of overtime. On a really good backhand look that she sprawls out, just gets enough of it, and then Alex Carpenter comes in and sweeps the puck away. So that was a really cool moment of like, okay, these 2 former Sirens are putting it all on the line to try and win this game for a Seattle team that is completely out of the playoff mix, completely out of the playoff race, but is still fighting really hard for this game, and those 2 especially. Season-high 37 saves for Corinne Schroeder. She was fantastic. That's a game that probably doesn't reach either overtime or the shootout if she doesn't stand on her head the way she did in that game. So, for Sirens fans, I think I said this in a video earlier or a tweet earlier leading in. I hope that there's a little bit of appreciation that they were able to be a part of that moment in MSG. Obviously I think it stings to watch 2 players that you loved on an opposing team. And again, the fact of the matter is with expansion, you were going to lose at least 2 players that you loved anyway. But, those were 2 fan favorites. But I think pretty cool that they end up getting to be a part of that moment. The Sirens getting to play at the Garden, the first PWHL game at the Garden. It's a big moment for New York. They know. They went through it for 2 years at New York, and they know all about some of the attendance struggles. So for them to be there, even if they're on the opposing side in that game, I think that's a pretty decent full circle moment for them to get to be there and to get to even take part in some of those ovations. Schroeder got a huge hand when she got named the 3rd star of the game, and she got a huge hand from the crowd. And had Carpenter been named a star, I think she would have gotten a huge hand from the crowd. That booing, I think that's just good, clean sportsmanship. That's what you want to see from an intense game like that. I think Hillary Knight got booed too. And they talked about it afterwards. They said, we expect it when we're on the road. Our fans boo opposing teams when we're at home. So they seem to be into it. I think that all worked out pretty well. There are a few other, right, we're talking about big game moments and big game players. Alex Carpenter is a big game player. So is Sarah Fillier. Right, what a week she's had. Willing the team to a win Wednesday with that natural hat trick against Minnesota. And then, again, maybe your season's on the line here. Certainly that game at the Garden is on the line. And who gets the equalizer? It's Sarah Fillier. Now, she did a lot of the work herself on Wednesday. She got a lot of help from Ann Czerkowski on that play. That play really starts with Czerkowski spinning away from Kayla Barnes off the wall. Perfect pass. Ann Czerkowski had a great game. Some of the point numbers and certainly the goal numbers have been a little quiet for her of late. But the last few games, you've kind of started to see her settle into a groove. That's the best game she's had in a while. She was noticeable on the ice. O'Brien, too. O'Brien, there were a lot of times where O'Brien looked like the fastest player on the ice. But Ann Czerkowski really made a lot of positive things happen in the offensive zone. And that play is really all her spinning away and setting up Fillier. All Fillier has to do there is punch it into an empty net. That's how good of a pass Czerkowski had. So, heck of a game from Ann Czerkowski there. Nyland Pearson plays over 27 minutes. The final tally is 27-31, which is a career high. And obviously she has the shootout goal. a lot of big moments in this game, right? I mentioned the Cherkowski gets the breakaway in overtime that Schroeder stops. Almost easy to forget. Emmy Fecto got ejected in the first period, right? Drives her elbow into the head of Michaela Grant-Mentis, and that ends up being a 5-minute major. Seattle doesn't score, but Carpenter scores like 3 seconds after it expires. You almost forget about that Fecto penalty because of all the stuff that happens afterwards and that super exciting overtime period into the shootout. That Fecto, I think the game itself was a little low event, maybe the first 10 minutes or so. That Fecto hit really kicked things into high gear. That was a pretty funny sequence because Seattle goes down and scores, but the play is whistled dead. It's kind of crazy that initially that hit wasn't called a penalty because right from the jump, us in the press box were like, oh, she's going to go to the box for that. And then we saw the replay, and you see the elbow make pretty clear-cut contact with the head there. So not much of a debate on that call. It stinks for Emmy Fecto that really only plays a little over a minute in that game. But still certainly part of the canon of that game and how we get to where we end up by the final horn. The shootout's pretty crazy. Anna Wilgren almost scored on a Forsberg move. And basically by the grace of God, that puck hugs the goal line. And that was, one of the co-hosts of Jocks and Jills was in the press conference postgame and asked Kaylee Osborne about that and what she saw on that save. And she was like, yeah, it was a great move. I thought it was going to go in. I was just hoping it didn't. And, just a mere inches away from that puck going in. And then Fillier comes down, and I don't know if any of you guys clocked this, basically hits the same move that she used when she scored on the breakaway out of the penalty box against Minnesota, kind of like speeding all the way through and just a really quick puts on the backhand kind of before the goalie can react and flicks it in top shelf. Man, Sarah Fillier has got a really nasty backhand there, and when she moves with speed, whew. So a lot of really cool moments in that game. Maybe another thing that's easy to get lost in this game and the win is that it was not the smoothest game for the Sirens. Obviously they get the goal late from Fillier, but there's a while there. You almost wonder if were the Sirens too excited? That's a pretty wild environment, kind of an environment that they really haven't experienced, certainly on their side of things. They've been to big takeover tour games, but that's a lot of times the crowd is split. This is a game where 85-90% of the crowd is behind you, if not more. And so obviously there's a lot of energy there. And you wonder if that maybe affected them a little bit. They had a really tough time stringing passes together. More so like the final pass that would set up a scoring chance, So there were a lot of times where, open look if you can get into the slot, or, there's a breakout chance, and passes missing wide, passes hitting skates and hitting the opposing team's sticks. I even noticed it on the power play. And New York's power play looked better on Saturday. One of the things that Greg Farco talked about after Wednesday's win against Minnesota was, we need to put some work in on the power play because we're getting a little too comfortable in the perimeter. Better showing Saturday. They really tried to get into the slot, and they had looks there. They just couldn't connect the passes. And that was a big storyline through the first 40 minutes, is that the Sirens were not super crisp, especially in the offensive zone, and taking a major penalty certainly didn't help. Penalty kill actually held up pretty well, but Seattle just keeps coming and coming, and even though the penalty expired, Alex Carpenter's goal was basically a power play goal because it was all the attrition from 5 straight minutes on a 5-on-4. So that's another thing when we talk about the complete 60 minutes. The Sirens still have not achieved that. At least I don't think. They felt very good about their win over Minnesota. Again, I said this after that game, that I think there's still stretches you can point to where they really kind of fell asleep. listen, no team, it's really hard for a team to play a perfect 60 minutes of hockey, but what we're talking about is any stretches where the Sirens, execution-wise, noticeably struggling, or just energy-wise noticeably struggling. Energy, not an issue in this MSG game, nor should it be. If energy was an issue, that would be, sound the alarms, we've got a major problem. But certainly execution, I think, was a big problem in those first two periods. But Sarah Fillier ties the game. You find a way to get it to the shootout, and they pull out the win. And that's kind of, at the end of the day, all that matters. Obviously, listen, the Sirens need to play a complete 60 minutes of hockey more often than not down the stretch here to make the playoffs. But you got to get the points any way that you can. And especially coming off of that post-Olympic skid, if you get a win in a game that you didn't play perfect hockey, you'll still take that and then try and figure out, all right, what are the things that we need to improve upon moving forward. Not going to linger too much on the playoff picture today. We did a lot of that in the last episode, but just a quick update. So now they're back within a win. So now they've really rejoined the playoff picture. If they lose that game, you're still 5 points out of the playoffs with 5 games to go. They can overcome that for sure. But now you're back within a game. One regulation win away from being tied for a playoff spot. That's a big deal. Now, they're going to need... They don't need as much help anymore is the thing, right? Now you have a chance where you play Ottawa once, you play Toronto twice. And you look at their last 5 overall, it's not an easy schedule. It's at Minnesota, home against Toronto, at Ottawa, at Toronto, at Boston. So that's 3 games against teams you're vying for that final playoff spot with, and 2 teams against the general consensus top 3 teams in the PWHL. I guess an update on the general playoff picture is kind of what we had known for a while, with the big gap between the top 3 of Boston, Minnesota, and Montreal is solidified. Minnesota clinched a playoff berth with a 6-5 win Saturday afternoon. So, that's it. The 3 playoff spots are the top 3 playoff spots are all locked up. And now it's that one final playoff spot, and it's going to come down really to Toronto, Ottawa, or New York. But they're back in the picture. It's back-to-back overtime wins. So that's 2 points instead of 3. Listen, obviously you'd love to get a regulation win at some point down the stretch here. But you'll take if you get 5 more overtime wins, there's a decent chance that you'll make the playoffs, especially because that means you'll be taking down Ottawa and Toronto. It won't be good for the heart rate, but it can get done. And that's what being within a regulation win of the playoff spot kind of does for you, is that, all right, you don't really need to win out over those last 5 games. You go 3-2, that could be enough. 4-1 feels like a really good lane. The goal is definitely, you got to be above 500, right, in those last 5 games. But, for all the injuries with this team and Carlton Kova being on LTIR, they're finding a way to rally. And there was a stretch there where it looked like that they could go out kind of sad and kind of peter out. And it does seem like they've at least got one last rally or one last surge in them. And, we'll see if it's enough. They'll have a decent chance to control their destiny, right? If you can beat Toronto and Ottawa, you put yourself in a pretty good position there to make the playoffs. So that's kind of cool. Moving forward, and this is kind of the last 2 points that we'll end on here. More games at MSG? Is that in the cards? That Greg Fargo certainly wants it. One of the first questions, actually the first question, after when Greg Fargo and Fillier and Kaylee Osborne come into the press conference was, what city or what arena would you guys like to play in next? Tough first question after a game like that. Not the first question I would have asked, regardless. And they did a good job. I thought they did a really good job of that answer.
What big arena or city would you love to play in the future? This is for all 3 of you.
I'd love to play as many games right back here as possible. I think that'd be great.
Retweet. I agree. It was awesome. I'd love to be able to come back here.
That's certainly the hope, right? Is that the Sirens can have a few more games here at Madison Square Garden, and that it's not a one-off. there's a lot of discourse going on online right now. If you're in PWHL and specifically Siren circles, that I'm not particularly interested in getting into here. Obviously, a full-time residency at MSG is not in the cards. Right, you get the Rangers, you get the Knicks, and you've got every musical or comedy act on earth that wants to come through and book the Garden. So, space is at a premium. So, as much as there are people that want the Sirens to find a place in New York City, it's not going to be the Garden, certainly in the next few years, right? But, could this be a once-a-year thing, the Sirens play somebody at the Garden? I think that would be cool. I think that certainly can be done, right? There are always open days in the Garden schedule that can be, even if I really like the idea of doing it as a doubleheader with the Rangers. I think that really helps. Probably a lot of Ranger fans, and there were a lot of Ranger fans that stayed and did the doubleheader. I think that's an easy way. You get people into the city. Hey, just wait around a few more hours, go to Mustang Harry's, get a couple beers, get some food, come back, watch the Sirens game. Or if you want to flip it the other way, the Sirens play first, and then all right, come back and the Rangers have the night shift. However you want to do it. I think a doubleheader is a pretty cool way to do it. I guess I will dip my toe into the Rock New York City thing a little bit. Listen, in my experience, the Rock has been very easy to get to. Now, I live in Brooklyn, and so I live right by the C train. It's very easy for me to get to the Path. I understand why there might be. I think there's certainly a stigmatism with New Yorkers about whether or not they want to go into Jersey. I certainly, I'll be honest. Before I got this job, I was like, oh man, I have to go into Jersey. I'm a New York City boy by trade. I've been pleasantly surprised with how easy it is to get to the Rock. That's just my experience. I know you all live in different areas, so there's not going to be one spot that's perfect for everyone. The thing you got to remember with the Sirens is that you've got this fusion of fans of and Philadelphia doesn't have a PWHL team, so you've basically got Islanders fans out from Long Island that might also be Sirens fans. Anyone living in the city, even go up to Connecticut, right, when they were playing in Bridgeport, that the Sirens reach probably extends up there. And then you go into Jersey, and honestly, probably into, South Jersey / almost Philadelphia, of people that are Sirens fans and follow this team. So, right, for the people in Jersey or Philadelphia, well, hey, the Rock's a lot easier than MSG or UBS or Bridgeport. If you're coming from the island or from the city, maybe the Garden is a little bit easier to get to than the Rock. Listen, I think the Sirens would be foolish to abandon the Rock right now. And again, MSG is not an option to be a full-time home for them. So I think to a certain extent, some of the conversation that's being had online is a little pointless. And let's just enjoy. It was awesome. It was awesome for the Sirens to be in MSG. And it'd be really cool if they can do that again. I saw even someone suggest, what if they did a game at UBS too? A one-off game, and it's a little bit different than it was a couple years ago when you're kind of trying to feel everything out and see what's our best venue for long-term success. I think Prudential probably easier to get to from different places than UBS, just because of Long Island Railroad versus having both the Path and Amtrak, and when you think about some of the Philadelphia fans, the Rock being a little more central location-wise. But I think it'd be cool if the Sirens did a one-off game at UBS once a year too. Do a tour around the New York City arenas. And obviously, one of the issues early on that first year was that they didn't have a permanent home. So I'm not saying abandon the Rock as your permanent home. The Rock's your home. That's where you'll do most of your home games. But you want to do one game at the Garden, one game at UBS, and you play it up as kind of like a special event thing. I think you get pretty good crowds. So those are my 2 cents. In terms of moving forward, what's the best thing for the Sirens in building on this record-setting attendance? It's making the playoffs. They'll have one more game Wednesday, April 15th at home. I think Hopefully another game over 4,000 if you're following the attendance trends. Maybe they'll get even more seeping over from this MSG game. But a playoff game at the Rock would be pretty cool. And not just pretty cool, I think it could be the culmination of the attendance growth that we've seen this year. It'll be tough to draw 18,000, that's for sure. But, could they break 10,000 for a playoff game? I really think so. And that would be, I think, the best way to capitalize on this momentum, is while you're still in everyone's, people have short attention spans. But if the Sirens make the playoffs a month after the MSG game, I think you draw some extra people in there. And, especially if the Devils miss the playoffs, there's always the chance you get your logo on center ice. And right, we've seen that happen with the PWHL with, some of the residencies where when the main team, once their season's over, once they're eliminated from the playoffs, that they can go back under the ice and actually change the center ice logo. I think that's in the cards for the Sirens this year with how the Devils are playing, that, that's in the cards if they make the playoffs in May. And you'd only be guaranteed one home game, because if you make the playoffs, you'll be the 4 seed. You'll be on the road the first 2 games. But even one home game at the Rock in the playoffs, I think would be pretty cool. And yeah. So that's all I have to say on that. Another quick, interesting thing, and I'm not gonna bog this episode down because it's been a pretty happy and uplifting episode, as it should be. It was a pretty happy and uplifting game on Saturday. But one of the things that came up in the pregame press conference, and there was a lot of talk about the future of the PWHL and where this league is going and the New York market. One of the things that came up was expansion. And obviously there hasn't been a ton of information out there. We got a little nugget from Stan Kasten. And he said expansion news is coming in the next couple of weeks. Now, obviously we're all in the dark. I can tell you that the PWHL teams and general managers are also in the dark about what's going on. That they don't know how many teams the league is going to expand to. We've heard both 2 and 4 as possibilities. They don't know anything about what the expansion protection process will look like. Heard from one general manager that, I would have done things differently at the trade deadline if I knew exactly what expansion was going to look like, but I don't, so I'm just kind of guessing here. That's not really an ideal setup for expansion. And you kind of saw how rushed everything was coming into this season. And, right, like the Seattle and Vancouver don't have their logos on the jerseys because the names didn't come around until late, because they're doing all this stuff on the fly and they're working super quickly and they're not being incredibly transparent about the plans or anything like that. I get there's a lot of moving parts to this. It does not seem like an ideal setup of how to run expansion. I've got my own concerns anyway about what is this league going to look like when you expand and dilute the player pool, because I already think sometimes that there's a divide between your top players and your top goal scorers and some of the bottom 6 talent in this league. And what's this league going to look like if some of the bottom 6 talent all of a sudden has to start playing a middle 6 role? What's that going to do for the product? I think that's a fair concern to have. It's a concern I have certainly if they're actually pondering doing 4 teams. And I think the on-ice product gets worse. And the other thing about that, and it's a point Rachel Donner brought up on the press box, I saw when I tweeted about it, Ian Kennedy replied and mentioned that it's something he's talked to with GMs about, is officiating. When you expand, you have to add more officials. And the officiating has not been good this year. That's just straight up. And even in the MSG game, they had an awful tripping call that they charged to Seattle, where El Harchi just slipped and fell. And the player wasn't even close to her. And they called a tripping penalty on Seattle. There's been a lot of really confusing moments. There was that a few weeks ago at home at the Rock. I'm struggling to remember the exact details, but right, they don't blow the whistle on the delayed penalty, but then they still give New York the too many players on the ice penalty. there's been some really rough officiating this year. And those are the best officials available. So you're going to dive into an even deeper officiating pool with officials that, in theory, aren't as good. And what's that going to look like? With the players, at least, you're talking about the best available players, that even if you open up that pool a little bit wider, you're still talking about the best female players in the sport. With the officials, the best officials go to the NHL, and maybe they also go to the AHL or any of the other men's leagues around that pay better. So you're not picking from an elite pool of officials to begin with. And that is, it hurts the on-ice product, 100%. So I'm not going to drag this down too much with the expansion talk. It's definitely coming. You can tell the way they talk about it. And Stan even said, we're operating at a loss right now, but it doesn't matter because we believe in this investment, and there's so many different cities that want to get in on this league, and that's a positive. And the more that this league can spread to other places, I do think ultimately is a good thing. If the league gets a foothold in Denver, I think that'd be awesome. There are really good hockey towns that I think would do a really good job with having a team. Look at Vancouver and Seattle. They've done their fan bases have done a great job so far. But there's really legitimate concerns about how the league is handling this and whether or not they're rushing into it. What I'll say is the hard truth is, with this Sirens team, you're going to lose, once again, you're going to lose players that you love. And I'll just cherish these last 5 games as much as you can. And you may roll your eyes because I roll my eyes. This is a parallel that I'll do for you guys. When I was in college, people would always tell me, don't take it for granted. Make sure to enjoy it because it goes by too quickly. And it's really hard to enjoy something when you're thinking about how quickly it's going to end. So I realize that I'm doing the same thing to you guys, and that's not nice or fair. But, it probably isn't worth having a ton of anxiety about what this is going to look like in the offseason because no one knows. Even people in higher up positions than me and you. No one knows. So enjoy this ride, and certainly if the Sirens make the playoffs, enjoy this team because it probably is going to look different next season. But that's a shame that's a little bit of a downer to end on this episode. That's my fault. In terms of stuff moving forward, I'll be going to practice Tuesday and Wednesday. I'll have conversations with Casey O'Brien, Maya Nyland-Pearson, and Ann Cherkowski, so we'll have that stuff on the way. I'll be talking to Greg Fargo as well. There's some points I want to make about Nicole Valario and Denisa Shisheva and their roles on the team that probably not the episode to get into here. This is an episode about the MSG game and the future of this team and all that stuff. But in the next episode, I think I want to take the opportunity. We saw some interesting things with how they used Shisheva on Saturday. Got more of an indication of what role she's going to play with this team. Same thing with Nicole Valario. So I think those are 2 areas that we can really dive into next time. But yeah, that'll do it in terms of my own stuff for the website. A reaction article to that Garden game with quotes from all the players on both sides. That I think is a really cool window into how the players reacted to that game. I'll have some more stuff throughout the week. I'll probably have another notebook column or another reaction piece once I'm done talking to the players at practice. So look for that either Wednesday or Thursday. I did hop on the Rink Rap podcast on Saturday at Mustang Harry's in between the Rangers game and the Sirens game. It was recorded before the Sirens played, but there's still, I think, some of the stuff that we get into today about, what this game can do. And I guess I didn't get into a ton, but, what this game can do for bringing in new eyeballs and maybe attracting new fans. I think we touched on that a little bit when we talked about what maybe a playoff game could look like with the Sirens. But I think you've heard me harp on that point before. But yeah, that's it. Lou Orlando, Sweet Lou with 5 U's on Twitter. Sportsnaut.com/PWHL, I think is the... I'll cut that out if that's wrong. But, I always put the sticker below. So, yeah, that's it. Hey, heck of a game at MSG. What an experience. Yeah. See you guys around next time.